So let's dive right in. Thank you so much, Executive Director, for being here with us today. Always a pleasure to see you.
Always
Thank you.
always the pleasure. Likewise, just make sure y'all give Makisa my love. I see her popping in and out. Just make sure
Yes,
y'all tell Makisa I say
we will thank Makisa immensely for her assistance. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to dive right in. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. This is a safe environment. We want everyone to be comfortable in terms of asking your questions. So, I'll begin our fireside chat. Executive Director Horton, the last time you spoke with the Fair Housing Committee, you mentioned that there was an increase in complaints regarding disability. Have there been a decrease since in those complaints, or are you able to share with us at this time what is occurring in terms of the disability aspect?
Oh, great question. And one again, thanks to you, Robin, and Miss Rita. It's always a pleasure to be amongst my HCAR family, right? HCAR is where, I started my real estate journey. So for me, HCAR will always be part of my family. So again, thanks for the opportunity to speak and be in front of you all here today. So last time we talked about the number of cases spiking. Cases have continued to spike. I think in part what we talked about um, was that in 2016, as an agency, collectively, we saw a doubling of the number of inquiries that were coming into our agency during the first iteration of the Trump administration. During the second iteration of the Trump administration, we are seeing now the same thing again. So, in essence, the number of inquiries that our agency is receiving has quadrupled in the last 10 years or so. And that is across the board, right? So that's employment, housing, public accommodations, commercial leasing, state contracts, and the provision of health services. So we are seeing that increase across the board. When we think about part of what I believe we talked about specifically around housing is the significant spike in our source of income cases. So while disability remains the top protected class, we continue to see a spike in source of income. Last year, I believe source of income was our third highest protected category, and it continues to climb, right? So it's gone from being not a protected class to now being the third highest protected class when we think about fair housing. So I think that is important to note, and it continues to rise. It still has a ways to go before it overtakes disability, but we are concerned about the trajectory when we think about source of income complaints across the board.
Okay, thank you for that. I have another question that I'm hoping you would be able to provide some insight on if you can.
Yep.
Do you think, and this is just your opinion, I'm not going to hold you to anything. I like how you laugh, so you probably can gauge where I'm going right now. In your opinion,
Yeah.
do you think the Maryland Commission on Civil Rights will see more complaints as a result of the 16 state attorney generals filing a lawsuit against HUD regarding alleged threats to withhold funding from the state and local fair housing enforcement. And that pertains to the housing counseling and all of that. That's just an extra question because there are some intricacies involved with that. So I just wanted to get your opinion. Are
So
you able to?
yeah, as you know, we are one of the 15 states that are included in that lawsuit, right? So there are certain things that I can't legally talk about.
Understand?
But I will say this. I think that I do want to take my hat off to those other 15 states who have signed on to this litigation against the Department of Housing and Urban Development. I think if nothing else, what this lawsuit does send is a clear message to HUD is that we are no longer going to stand by and allow you to do whatever you want to do because you hold the purse. And I think that is very important when we think about the times that we find ourselves in. So when we think about the fact that we are in unprecedented times right now, the fact that this administration, and again, I don't want to make it too political, but you just have to say it, right? So this administration is being very intentional and strategic around creating um, divisive communities, right? In terms of, especially from a civil rights enforcement standpoint. So we know that for the most part, civil rights enforcement at the Department of Housing and Urban Development was gutted through Doge. It was gutted through a number of rifts through this administration. So what that leaves is that individuals who are filing complaints of housing discrimination with nowhere to turn except to their state and local governments, right? Um, to exacerbate that condition, what HUD has done is held back funding and also created different directives that will indicate that many agencies that have been considered to be substantially equivalent are no longer substantially equivalent. And what that means is that typically agencies, as long as you cover the 7 federally protected classes, you are always considered to be substantially equivalent. And you could participate in programs like the FIT program, which is the Fair Housing Initiative program, and the FAT program, which is the Fair Housing Assistance program, and get additional federal dollars for the investigation of fair housing complaints. So what HUD has done by issuing some of their most recent directives is said, if you cover anything outside of those 7 federally protected classes, you are no longer considered substantially equivalent. So what this directive does is it gets directly to what this administration wants, is that you don't cover sexual orientation. You don't cover things like criminal records or source of income. And if you cover those particular areas, then the federal government is going to be deeming those agencies no longer substantially equivalent, which is a direct hit to their budget. So as you think about the landscape in terms of where we are, so individuals who are turning to HUD for fair housing investigations, now HUD doesn't have the appropriate staff to respond to those complaints. And now those complaints are being shifted to state and local organizations like the Maryland Commission on Civil Rights. Now that's exacerbated because now those agencies are seeing a reduction in their funding from the federal government to also investigate those complaints. So you can only do but so much. So now some of those smaller agencies have to reduce the services that they provide to the public in reference to fair housing. So what you're seeing is just across the board a diminution in services that are being provided from fair housing enforcement, fair housing education, because the agencies that are carrying the brunt of the work are also losing the funding to be able to do so adequately. So that's kind of the environment that we find ourselves in. So the litigation, again, that was signed on by 15 other agencies is a direct result of some of the most recent directives issued by HUD and our attempt to address that and provide some redress to that, not just for agencies, but for the public as a whole, to make sure that agencies like the Maryland Commission on Civil Rights and other state and local agencies have the adequate funding to protect fair housing throughout our country and to make sure that HUD is abiding by all of the contractual language and all of our contracts moving forward.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate it. Here at HCAR, the Fair Housing Committee is working very diligently to make sure that realtors are always aware of and abreast of things that are going on as it pertains to fair housing.
Yep.
What is most critical for realtors to always keep at the forefront about fair housing when working with their clients?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think to try and make it as simple as possible, always do what's right, right? I think, for me, that's the most important thing. Not to allow the transaction to dictate the action. The action should always be dictated by doing what's right. And sometimes doing what's right is not the popular thing, right? It's not the thing that our clients want us to do. But as realtors, we should always be in the position to do what's right and to do what we know is right. But I think in order to do that, I think it requires us to get an adequate level of training year in and year out to make sure that we are aware of the trends, the trending topics, the new coverages, the new authorities, so that we can make sure that we in turn are educating our clients correctly. We do have individuals who are operating in this space that have a lower level of fair housing knowledge and education than we would like. So we do just want to make sure that realtors are taking fair housing seriously and getting the adequate training. But again, I would say for me, it's very simplistic. It is ensure that you are always doing what's right. Dr. King indicated that the time is always right to do what is right. And we do want to make sure that as realtors, we're always doing that.
Thank you. 100% agree with you on that. In your opinion, based on where we are today, and this is Fair Housing Month,
Mhm.
why do you think that fair housing remains a big issue today?
Mm. Ah, um, I think no matter what we do, right, fair housing will always be a core issue, and that's because fair housing is fundamental to everything that we do in our society, right? So for me, housing is the fundamental pillar for everything, right? And we think about housing, I think sometimes we take it for granted, right? So many of us, if we think back to just as simple as thinking of some of our lifelong friendships, right? These are individuals that we met when we were 9, 10 years old in the neighborhood that we continue to have those friendships with, we continue to have those close partnerships with. Housing dictates that. Housing dictates the level of education that you get, the quality of that education. Housing indicates the quality of healthcare and access to healthcare that you have in the community. Housing dictates the level and quality of health choices and food choices that you have within a particular neighborhood or access to jobs. So for me, when we take a look at all of the other issues that are prevalent in our communities, housing is at the fundamental core of all of those issues. And that's for me, I think housing continues to be a major issue. It will always be a major issue because housing impacts everything. So we talk about the fact that zip codes matter, but zip codes shouldn't matter, right? Place matters, right? So all of those things truly do impact, your cost of living, just everything. So for me, that's why housing will continue to be, for us, the fundamental priority at the Maryland Commission on Civil Rights.
Mm, Thank you for that. It's amazing how there has been a lot of change, but yet it's still work to be done. That's how we all should pretty much view this. Oftentimes, when we look at issues pertaining to fair housing matters, some of them are single family home generated or apartments. I want to pivot a little differently in terms of my next question, and that is, has your office received complaints against HOA associations? Because sometimes there are things, sometimes or perhaps oftentimes, there are issues that may occur as it pertains to HOA association. Have you guys experienced that as well in terms of complaints?
We have. And I think part of the troubling scenario of complaints against HOAs is that, and I don't necessarily fault HOAs for this, but typically to be on a board of a HOA, there's no fair housing requirement, right? So many of the individuals that sit on these boards of these HOAs have little to no fair housing training or education, right? But they sit in positions of power and of decision-making authority. So when they make these decisions, whether it's about a reasonable accommodation or whatever it may be, that's going to impact someone's housing, they aren't trained or educated in reference to how this could impact or be a violation of the Fair Housing Act. So when we do get these complaints, part of what we do see is just a lack of training and education for these individuals. I think it should be pertinent around when we think about HOAs and how they are forming these boards in terms of how to create more of an atmosphere and an environment where, maybe part of the requirements are that you have some level of fair housing training and fair housing education. Because that is for us critical in reference because you're going to need to be making decisions about people's housing, right? Whether it's a architectural plan that somebody's submitting to change something in that house for whatever reason it may be, whether it's a parking space issue, whatever it may be, right? So individuals need to be aware of and educated on the Fair Housing Act, in our opinion, in order to be able to do that. But I would say that's one of the key areas and key opportunities that we see amongst HOAs is that you just have people who live in these communities that want to be on the board, they get on the board, and we commend them for volunteering. But we also do want to make sure that folks have the adequate fair housing training to be able to make the correct decisions.
Now, as it pertains to,
Question on that?
okay, I just want to.
Okay.
Well, Kimberly, we will get to your question in terms of, you know what, let's go to Kimberly's question and then I'll come back. Kimberly, do you want to ask your question live?
Go ahead and read it, because she can.
Where is her? Why, Cleveland, the question is, why are HOAs required to understand fair housing? Why aren't?
All right. Yeah. So we don't regulate HOAs, right? So HOAs aren't regulated obviously by the Maryland Commission on Civil Rights, nor are we asking to regulate HOAs either. So it's important to think about how the bylaws are written for the HOAs, what are the requirements to be a board member. That's really where a lot of the impact around what the requirements are to be a board member. That's probably for me, that's where the work needs to begin in reference to what are some of the requirements that are being implemented for folks to sit on these boards of these HOAs, because I would think at, a very fundamental level, you should have some understanding of the Fair Housing Act, because again, the decisions that you make as an HOA are obviously impacting folks' housing. And you may do so, right, with no intent to discriminate, no intent to violate the Fair Housing Act. But because you don't have the requisite training or education, you could in fact be violating the Fair Housing Act. So what that does is now it puts the HOA liable for the decisions of the board, which again could be detrimental to the HOA and that community that they serve, because it could come with a hefty fiscal note attached to it, depending upon the violation. So I definitely think that there needs to be some conversations around the requirements for folks to sit on HOAs. And obviously that's HOA specific, because we can't mandate that HOAs have this fair housing training or education. But we do realize the benefit and the asset of having that knowledge and education and how that serves the HOAs better.
So in essence, to continue the dialogue, it would be beneficial as well for the realtors to have the conversations with their clients in terms of, I don't necessarily want to use the word what to expect, but reviewing those bylaws and knowing ahead of time what certain things can be done or whatever in the event a potential new homeowner in that association decides to file a suit. Would you agree?
Yeah, but I would say too, realtors, it's a slippery slope at times, right? Because realtors also need to be cognizant of the fact that we don't want to be giving legal advice, right?
Right.
Because so you do want to be very mindful of the level of advice that you're giving to your clients. I think the expectation, the easiest advice is really to make sure that they're aware and familiar with the Fair Housing Act. But part of the responsibility is also on the client, right? The client's responsibility to make sure that they are reading and understanding what the Fair Housing Act is. I would say that the realtor should be careful about clarifying or providing interpretations of the Fair Housing Act, because that could be interpreted as giving legal advice, right? Which then puts you into a different realm with a different set of issues as well. So just be mindful of that. But I do think though, as realtors, if we're having clients and they're asking us to make decisions or do certain things, then we should be validating those decisions with how they comply with the Fair Housing Act, right? So if your client is requesting that you do something, and if you know based off of your education and training that violates the Fair Housing Act, then one, you should be letting them know that it violates the Fair Housing Act, and you should be sending them to the Fair Housing Act, that the section that's being violated, right? So that they can read it for themselves, so that they can understand what it is, and let them know that you can't do that because it is a violation of the Fair Housing Act.
Which leads me into my next question. So thank you for that. The next question is, when it comes to multifamily properties being sold, what should realtors, in your opinion, do to ensure that the new landlord does not violate any fair housing laws as it pertains to the tenants that's in place? Because oftentimes, let's say someone purchases a home, a multifamily property, and there are tenants in place, and how should the realtor convey and have the conversation about the Fair Housing Act to those individuals as well?
So it's tricky, right? Because I guess it depends on who you're representing too, right? So if you're representing the buyer or the seller, um, your duty is different, right? So I think obviously if you're representing the seller, and your client is selling the property, then I would say the only real the responsibility that you have is to acknowledge that there are tenants in the building, right? And to acknowledge that the appropriate communication is happening between obviously your client, who's the seller, and the new client that's coming in, which is the buyer, right? Um, Individuals, we are not here to tell folks how to run their business, right? So if folks want to renovate buildings or do something different with the folks that are in the building, obviously they have to give the appropriate notice, but that's more on the buyer side, right? So we want to make sure if you're a buyer's agent that your client, if your client is new coming in and they're aware of who the tenants are, that they're given the appropriate notice of any changes to any leases or occupying of the facilities, that your clients are giving the appropriate notice. But once that property changes hands, right, that's a business transaction.
Right.
And the Maryland Commission on Civil Rights doesn't oversee business transactions, right, in the sense of telling folks what to do and how to do it. We just want to make sure that folks' fair housing rights are obviously not violated. But for me, it's down to really communication, right, and giving folks the appropriate notice regardless of what's going on.
Okay, the only reason why that question came to mind would be in the event there would be a property that may have been sold and there could be someone with a voucher in the event that there's an increase in the rent and things of that nature. So that's why that question was posed to you.
No, it's
Uh,
and I would say still is a great question. I think even in that exact what you gave, Robin, like so, what one person charges for rent may not be what the next person is going to charge for rent, right? So that's when we talk about the proper notice, the proper communication, right? That obviously the new owner coming in has to be able to communicate, right, that to the tenants. What one seller was offering as a, rent may have even been lower than market value, right? So there are a lot of things that are at play, which is why we say at the commission that we stay out of the transactional piece of it.
mhm.
We just try to operate more so on the fair housing lens of was it done adequately, consistently, and equitably throughout the transaction, right? So those are the things that we look at, but we don't necessarily tell folks how to operate their business or how to go about doing some of those things.
Okay, thank you. Are there any updates that you can provide to us as it pertains to source of income or any additional things that the real estate agents should be aware of at this time? Because everything changes. There's could be something that comes out every day. And for us, it's important that we want to make sure that the members here at HCAR are fully aware of this. So that's why, again, we thank you so much for being here with us today.
No, absolutely. No, thank you, Robin. I think so when we think about source of income, I think folks are probably, for the most part, moving away from the language that said no vouchers for the most part. We still do see that popping up from time to time, but it's significantly decreased in a number of violations that we see coming through our agency. What we do now see more frequently is the communications from realtors to individuals who are using vouchers that will indicate that the home is not pre-registered for a program, right? Um, and what we know is that for most programs, right? I'll never say 100% because I will say I'm never fully aware of 100% of all the programs, right? So, but I will say for the majority of programs, there is no pre-registration, right? So we know that folks have replaced the we don't accept voucher language with this property is not pre-registered for that program, so therefore you can't apply, right? And our position with that language is we accept that language the same way as the no voucher language, is that it's a direct violation of the Fair Housing Act and a violation of our Title 20 statute in terms of housing. So we do see that more often from realtors. And a lot of times I think realtors are taking the information because that's what their clients are telling them. So they're taking it from their client and then they are now disseminating that language directly to the client, which is a violation, right? So we do want folks to be mindful of the language that we're using, and that folks should be mindful that if there's typically in most of the programs not a pre-registration requirement, right? And we should not be using that language to disqualify or to prevent folks from applying for the properties that our clients have for rent.
Thank you. We have a question from Amalex. How can realtors protect themselves when working with tenants using vouchers, but other factors that are making it extremely difficult to assist?
I think, that's a great question. I think it depends on what factors you're referring to, right? So I think when we think about having criteria to rent property, obviously at the commission, we don't set criteria, right? We just simply say whatever criteria you have, that it needs to be consistent for all applicants for a particular property. So if you have a credit requirement, right, then folks are obviously required to meet the credit requirement. That is not a particular source of income issue. So if you're saying that, hey, folks need to have a 600 credit score, or whatever it may be, then you're applying that credit score across the board to everybody. And there's nothing, as the law is currently written, that would violate your client if they are using credit score. So, when we think about source of income is able to provide um, qualification for folks who are lower income, right? That they are able to participate in programs that could satisfy the income requirement piece, but it does not absolve them from some of the credit requirements, right? So I know in part of some of the previous conversations that we've talked about, though, I think we have to really give real consideration. It's on a case by case basis of how we're applying credit and income to any individual. And I say that in the case that typically, obviously, our clients use credit to determine how you pay your bills, how responsible are you with paying your bills on time. And we use credit as an indicator of that. Now, what I would say is if you have somebody that has, for instance, a 100% voucher, then is credit really important to you, right? Because you are guaranteed through the program and through the voucher that you're going to get 100% of your rent through the particular organization that is going to be paying you through that grant program. So how relevant or how important is credit at that point in time? So I would say that it's important for us to really evaluate these on a case by case basis to make sure that we're not just arbitrarily applying requirements just because, right? So I think we've had the conversation around source of income and how income is being applied to these individuals, right? So if I am, you know, if I'm only responsible for, let's say, 10% of the rental income, right, and I'm in a program that's covering 90%, and you have a requirement of you have to make 30 times the rent or whatever it is, the requirement for me at that point is only 30 times my 10%, not 30 times the rent, the entire rent, right? Because I'm only responsible for that 10%. And we want to make sure that realtors understand that and are applying that across the board in a consistent way, right? So what we've seen is that realtors have still taken folks who are obviously voucher holders and saying that you got to make 3 times the total amount of the rent. Well, that's impossible for somebody that is on a voucher because if you're on a voucher, typically you're low income, you'll never be able to meet that 3 times the income standard, right? Because of where your income already is. So we want to make sure that folks are applying the standard the right way and accurately, because you can only apply that to the portion that they are responsible for. So whether it's 10%, 5%, 25%, or whatever it is, that is the only portion that you can apply your income requirements to, and you can't apply it to the total amount of the rent on any particular property. So I think that's important to know. But
Thank you.
again, it doesn't mean that just because somebody has a voucher, that your client is mandated to accept them as a renter. So we also don't want to create that environment either, that you have to overlook and bypass all of your other criteria just because they have a voucher. The source of income legislation was not created to do that.
Okay, thank you. We have another question, and that is from Pete DeDrew. Good morning. With all compensation now hidden in the MLS, realtors are showing rental homes without any promise of compensation. Are you receiving any complaints from renters whose realtor is withholding their services until they receive promise or guarantee of payment or not yet?
No, so we really haven't received any complaints on that, Pete. That's interesting. I think that I think that folks have to make a business decision in reference to who they're going to service, right? So obviously realtors don't work for free, right? Being a realtor is a business. And obviously being a business, there's a fee associated with your time, your advice, and your guidance. So when we think about it just from a fair housing perspective, if folks are withholding their services or not providing services because there is no form of payment, then that isn't in itself necessarily a fair housing violation, right? So again, folks have to do what's right for their business. I know, for instance, we have agents who don't do rentals at all, right? Agents, if you can contact an agent, may say, "Hey, I'm sorry, I don't do rentals." They may or may not refer you over to somebody else who does rentals. But again, that's a business decision, and agents have the right to make those business decisions in reference to what's best for their business. And folks operate differently, right? Some folks will, provide you service, and if there's no payment for it, folks just want to be able to provide a service and make sure you are able to get housing. Some folks taking a different approach, and we try not to, again, operate in a lane that tells people how to operate their business. Whatever business model you choose, that's good, that's best for you, then that's your right to choose it. But we just want to make sure that folks are choosing that business model consistently. And I say that because, for instance, if I choose that, when men contact me only, I'm saying, "Hey, no, I don't do rentals." But when women contact me, I'm like, "Hey, sure, I'll take you out and do rentals." Then someone could say that you're being discriminatory from a fair housing perspective and you're treating men differently than you're treating women. And then that could become an issue, right? So whatever business model you're going to choose, it all relates back to just being consistent with that model.
Thank you. We have an additional question,
Yep.
and that question is from Michael. What tools do you have and what tools do you use to enforce violations of the Fair Housing Act for landlords?
Yeah. So I would say it's Title 20 of the Annotated Code of Maryland, right? Which really talks about our housing enforcement authority. As an enforcement agency, that's really our tool, right? Our tool is the law, right? So we know what folks can and cannot do, and we hold folks to that. And so when we think about how do we enforce fair housing, it's different for different people, right? Because everything, I always tell folks that it's not just all black and white, right? It's not that you did this, you shouldn't have did this. This is what's going to happen to you, right? So there's a lot of different conversations that happen when there is a potential violation of a Fair Housing Act. And a part of that truly falls back to intent. What was the intent of the person, right? That was the individual, the landlord, intentionally discriminating against someone? Was it a lack of education, a lack of training? And the same thing for realtors, right? Because as realtors, you all can, one, be sued for fair housing violations, and you also can be harmed by fair housing violations. So we want to make sure, again, part of what I always talk about, that realtors understand that if your client is a victim of housing discrimination, you in part are also an aggrieved party. So you can also file a complaint because you've lost the transaction, you've lost the business, right? So you are now harmed. So you also can seek out remedies for fair housing violations too. On the flip side, right, you can also be held liable for fair housing violations. So if your client does something through you and you communicate that to a client and it's a violation, then now there's a violation against you, your brokerage, as well as the property owners. So just be mindful of that. But I would say the biggest tool that we have is the law, and that is the tool that we use to enforce violations of fair housing against landlords.
Okay, thank you. Excuse me. Does anyone else online with us have any questions? Because I don't want to detain the executive director too much longer because he does have another engagement. So at this time, if anyone has any additional questions, please present your question. Going once, going twice. This is not an auction, ladies and gentlemen, but I do want to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to ask a question. Okay, there being none, Executive Director, thank you so much for being here with us today. We greatly appreciate your time. We understand that you're very busy, you're doing a lot. So for you to be able to have this fireside chat with us today really means a lot. As I said, it is HCAR's mission, as well as the HCAR Fair Housing Committee's mission, to make sure that the membership here is informed as best as possible. So have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you so much.
And
You
thank
too.
you.
You know, anytime Ms. Rita asks me to show up, I'm going to show up. And the same for you, Robin. So anytime you all need me to show up, I will. Just let me know. It's my pleasure to provide any information that I can to the members of HCAR, and I'll always do that.
Thank you
So much. We
so
appreciate
much.
it.
All right.
have a
You all enjoy the
wonderful-
rest of your day.
Thank you.
You
You
too.
too.
Thank you. Take
All right.
care.
Happy Easter.
Happy Easter
to
Same to
everyone.
you.
to everyone. Take care.
Bye-bye.